Apologies for the dramatic entrance. I was misinformed about where to go and when to come, but otherwise everything was fine. Though I was directed to a locked, closed garage and wondered what to do with that. I'm sure that I'm not the only one to have been reminded in the past months of some wise and prescient remarks by one of the most impressive figures of 20th century America, the radical pacifist A.J. Muste. As the U.S. entered World War I 60 years ago, he predicted with some accuracy the contours of the world that would take shape after the American victory. And a little later, he observed that the problem after a war is with the victor. He thinks he has just proved that war and violence pay. Who will teach him a lesson? Far too many people around the world were to learn the bitter meaning of those words. It's only in folk tales and children's stories and the pages of journals of intellectual opinion that power is used wisely and well to eradicate evil in the world. The real world teaches quite different lessons, and it takes willful and dedicated ignorance to fail to perceive them. The successful use of violence typically engenders enthusiastic praise among the flatterers at the court, the secular priesthood of intellectuals in the modern era. As far as I know, that's universally true. At least I don't know of any exceptions. Even in the most monstrous states, so take, say, Hitler Germany. Hitler was probably the most popular leader in German history as long as he was marching from triumph to triumph. And Germany, we should remember, is represented the peak of the cultural and scientific peak of Western civilization. These are unfortunately leading themes of history and well-known ones. One of the main historians who studied European state formation, Charles Tilly, pointed out quite accurately that, I'm quoting him, that for a millennium, war has been the dominant activity of European states for a very good reason. The central tragic fact is simple: coercion works. Those who apply substantial force to their fellows get compliance, and from that compliance draw the multiple advantages of money, goods, deference, access to pleasures denied to less powerful people. The deference includes the awed claim of the educated classes, and costless destruction of defenseless enemies, that wins particular admiration. It also becomes habitual and natural and proof of one's virtue, so that the victors are suffused with a saintly glow at the height of their glory in a noble phase of their foreign policy. Actually, I don't have the imagination to make that up. I'm quoting it from some typical descriptions of U.S. leaders by eminent historians and commentators in the world's leading newspaper in the past few years. These are all historical truisms, or should be regarded as such, truisms that most of the people of the world have learned the hard way throughout history. One normal concomitant of easy victory over defenseless enemies is the habit of preferring force over the pursuit of other means, peaceful means. Another concomitant is the very high priority of acting without authority. So the incarnation of the God who comes to earth as the perfect man with the mission of eradicating evil from the world, he doesn't need any higher authority. That was true of the most ancient Indian epics from several millennia ago, and it holds as well for the vulgar plagiarism of today. The preference for reliance on force and the rejection of authorization and the impressive flights of self-adulation, immunity from elementary self-criticism. These have been very notable features of the last decade of overwhelming and unchallenged power and costless destruction of much weaker adversaries, all carried out in explicit accord with policy recommendations, with formulated policy recommendations, so not just by accident. I think that these are some of the considerations that ought to be in the back of our minds when we're contemplating the question that was raised for this session, the world after September 11th. Whatever judgment one may have about the events of the past few months, if you want to reach some kind of reasonable assessment of what may lie ahead, we ought to attend carefully to several crucial factors. One of them is the premises on which policy choices are based. That's obviously critical for figuring out what's likely to happen. A second is the roots of these choices in institutions and ideology, doctrines which are quite stable. And a third is the way that these doctrines and institutions have led to action in the very recent past, including actions crucially taken by the very people who are the leading decision makers today. All of that is critically important for trying to reach some sensible judgment about what the future may bring, at least if present tendencies continue. Well, the new millennium quickly offered two new and monstrous crimes, adding them to plenty of lingering ones. The first was, of course, the terrorist attacks of September 11th. The second is the response to them, which surely took a far greater toll and will take an even greater toll of innocent civilian lives, people who are innocent of any crime and who themselves are victims of the suspected perpetrators of the crimes of September 11th. I'll take for granted here that the perpetrators were the Al-Qaeda network and Osama bin Laden. There was a prima facie case supporting that at the outset, and it remains about as it was. No further evidence has come along, which is kind of remarkable, since this has surely been the most intense investigation on the part of the world's intelligence agencies in history. But these are hard things to figure out, and the fact they don't have much or any evidence is perhaps not too surprising. You can just consider the difficulty of finding out the source of the anthrax scare right here. There's plenty of other examples. In both of these cases, the crimes of September 11th and the crimes of the response, the crimes are considered right and just, in fact noble, within the doctrinal systems of the perpetrators. And in fact, they're justified by the perpetrators in almost the same words. So Osama bin Laden tells us that violence is justified in self-defense against the infidels who invade and occupy Muslim lands, and against the brutal and corrupt governments that they impose. These words they have quite considerable resonance in the region, even among people who despise and fear him, and in fact are his targets. Bush and Blair, and others like them, proclaim in virtually identical words that violence is justified to expel evil from our lands. The proclamations are virtually identical, but not entirely so. When Osama talks about our lands, Thanks. He's referring to Muslim lands, so Chechnya and Bosnia and Kashmir, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and others. The radical Islamists who were mobilized and trained and nurtured by the CIA and their associates through the 1980s, they despise Russia. But after the Russians had withdrawn from their territory, they did terminate the atrocities within Russia based in Afghanistan. They are, from their point of view, defending Muslim lands, Chechnya now, but not Russia itself. Bush and Blair, on the other hand, when they talk about our lands, they mean the whole world, and they're very clear about it. And that difference reflects the power that they command. The fact that either side can speak without shame of eradicating evil should leave us open-mouthed in astonishment, unless we adopt the easy course of just effacing even very recent history. Another fact that has grim portent is that in both of these cases, the adversaries insist on underscoring the criminality of their acts. They want you to know that they're criminal acts. That's obvious in the case of September 11th, so I won't comment on it. More striking and important for the future is that the same is true of the U.S. response. So the United States pointedly rejected the framework of legitimacy that resides in the international system and the UN Charter. There's no doubt that Washington could have obtained clear and explicit Security Council authorization, not for very attractive reasons. The reasons are clear enough. Russia and China are quite eager to have U.S. authorization for their own horrendous atrocities and crimes. They would therefore go along. England and France have a strong enough imperial legacy so that attacks against the lesser breeds raise no problems, so there would be no veto. But the U.S. chose very pointedly to reject Security Council authorization and to insist on its unique right to act unilaterally in explicit violation of international law and its treaty obligations, and unconstrained by any higher authority. It's incidentally a right that was forcefully proclaimed by Bill Clinton very explicitly, and his predecessors all in very clear and unambiguous terms. And these are warnings that we can choose to ignore if we like, but at our peril, and by ignoring them, surely undermining much possibility of understanding the world that's likely to develop. There's a leading principle of statecraft which lies behind this refusal. It even has a technical name in the literature. It's called establishing credibility. Credibility means that the subjects must know their place. To establish credibility, you make it clear that you act without authority. So if a mafia don wants to collect protection money, he doesn't get a court order, even if he could, because that would undermine credibility. It would imply that there is some authority, and there isn't. And the same holds in international affairs. If you look back at the arguments presented by the United States and Britain for the bombing of Serbia, that was the argument. There were peripheral ones which didn't make sense, but the main one which did make sense was that it's necessary to maintain credibility. Others have to know their place, and that therefore the lack of authorization is a crucial feature of the response. The same, incidentally, was true of the matter of extradition. We don't know if it would have been possible for the U.S. to obtain the extradition of Osama bin Laden and his associates. There were indications that the Taliban were considering that, but the U.S. was very quick to cut off that possibility. They don't want extradition. Extradition would again entail that there is a higher authority, like international law and standard procedures, and there isn't. You have to have the right to act unilaterally with unlimited violence decisively as you choose. That's credibility. Unfortunately, that's the way the world works. It's what Tilly is describing and what we know very well from recent history. Well, the reaction to these two crimes, the September 11th and the aftermath, that tells us quite a lot about what's likely to lie ahead if the current tendencies do persist. The atrocities of September 11th are generally regarded as a historic event, and that's true enough. But we should be clear about why. It's not because of the scale of the atrocities, unfortunately. In the civilian toll, the atrocities of September 11th are far from unusual in the annals of violence that falls short of war. All too many examples. For example, the number of people killed on September 11th is approximately the same as the monthly toll of Iraqi children killed as a result of the sanctions. It's been going on for 10 years. The number killed on September 11th is just a fraction of the civilian toll of the one truly uncontroversial case of international terrorism in the recent years, namely the U.S. attack against Nicaragua. Uncontroversial in the light of the judgment of the highest international authorities, the World Court and the Security Council. It's true that all of this has been expunged from history as a result of the normal workings of power, but it is history nevertheless, and not ancient history. In fact, the perpetrators of that crime, those condemned for that crime, happen to be the same people, by and large, who are now declaring a new war on terrorism. Not an insignificant fact, nor is the fact that it's ignored. So the atrocities of September 11th are indeed a historic event, but not because of the scale, rather because of the target. That's, in fact, something totally new. For the United States, this is the first time since the War of 1812, since 1814, when the British burned down Washington. It's the first time that the national territory has been under attack, or for that matter, under any threat. And there's some marginal exceptions, but that's basically true. Pearl Harbor Day yesterday had to do with attacks on U.S. colonies. The national territory has not been threatened or attacked. I won't bother to review what's been done to other people in the 2 centuries since that you're familiar with, not very pretty. On September 11th, for the first time, the guns were pointed in the opposite direction. And that's a dramatic change, a truly dramatic change. So it is a historic event. And the same is true even more dramatically for Europe. Europe, of course, has suffered murderous destruction and wars, but that's Europeans slaughtering each other. That's been the major sport of Europe for hundreds of years. Meanwhile, the European powers and their offshoots conquered much of the world, leaving a colossal trail of terror and destruction. But Europeans themselves were always safe from attack by their victims. The atrocities were somewhere else. And again, there's rare and limited exceptions. So it isn't at all surprising, in the light of hundreds of years of history, that Europeans should be utterly shocked by the crimes of September 11th, which are a drastic breach of the norms of acceptable behavior of hundreds of years. These are things we're supposed to do to them. They're not supposed to do them to us. And that's the historic change, which is real. It's also not surprising that Europeans and North Americans should remain complacent, maybe mildly regretful, about the even more terrible suffering that's followed September 11th. That dual reaction makes perfect sense. The victims of the second crime are, after all, just miserable Afghans uncivilized tribes, as Winston Churchill described them with great contempt, when he ordered the use of poison gas to inspire a lively terror among them 80 years ago. Remember, that was the ultimate atrocity at that time after the Second World War. And that's typical. Atrocities of that kind carry no moral stigma whatsoever, for one reason, because they're so familiar. Even when the only motive is there's no pretext other than just greed or domination. And retribution knows no bounds. There's ample historical precedent for that, and there's authority in the holiest texts that we're taught to revere. Another reason for the complacent acceptance of atrocities was explained quite eloquently by Alexis de Tocqueville in his classic study of democracy in America. He happened to be a witness, an eyewitness, of one of the great crimes of the cleansing of the continent, namely the expulsion of the Cherokees through the Trail of Tears, as it was called. And observing this terrible human tragedy, he wrote that he was particularly struck by the fact that the state terrorists could expel people from their lands and exterminate them without violating a single great principle of morality in the eyes of the world. It would be impossible to destroy people with more respect for the laws of humanity, he wrote. Well, there could hardly be a more apt description of what's been unfolding before our eyes in the last couple of months. And its very easy acceptance just reflects the fact that it's normal. That's the way the powerful deal with the weak and defenseless. It's in no way remarkable, and therefore it's not surprising that it elicits virtually no comment or concern. We don't have any right to, and we can choose to if we want, but we have no right to have any illusions about the premises that underlie current planning. That's the first factor that I mentioned with obvious import for understanding the future. The planning for the war in Afghanistan was based on explicit and unchallenged assumptions, which were quite clear and forthright. The assumptions were that first the threat of bombing and then the realization of the threat would increase the number of Afghan civilians at risk of death from starvation, disease, and exposure by about 50%. To about 7.5 million. So it would expose an additional 2.5 million people to the risk of imminent death. There were, I'm sure you know, pleas to stop the bombing, to allow the delivery of desperately needed aid. These were rebuffed without any comment, mostly without even any report. And they came from high UN officials, from the major aid agencies, from others in a position to know. By late September, so that's just before the bombing, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN had warned that more than 7 million people were facing starvation, would face starvation if the threatened military action was undertaken. And right after the bombing began, the FAO warned that there would be, warned of what it called a grave humanitarian catastrophe if this continued, and also advised that the bombing had disrupted the planting of 80% of the country's grain supplies, so that the effects next year are likely to be even more severe. All passed without comment or interest. What will actually happen, or is happening, we don't know, and we probably will never know. But we do know very well the assumptions on the basis of which the plans were laid and executed, and on the basis of which commentary about all of this proceeds. And I'll stress again that as a simple matter of logic, it's these assumptions that inform us about the shape of the world that lies ahead. It's the assumptions that tell us what's likely to happen. What may happen, we'll see. Nothing I've just said is challenged in any way. It's blandly reported, or else ignored, including the fact that right now, at this moment, virtually nothing is being done to bring food and other aid to people who are dying in refugee camps and in the countryside, even though the supplies are now available. And nothing hampers delivery in much of the country except the lack of interest and will, which does hamper it, in fact, prevent it. Well, for now, the effects are basically unknown, and they'll remain unknown, at least if history is any guide. These major atrocities just aren't reported today, scarcely reported. I find an occasional comment. And they're not going to be investigated tomorrow. Today, it is considered tolerable to report what's called collateral damage. That means bombing error. And that's an inevitable cost of war, so we can report it and be sorry, and it doesn't mean much. But what's not reported is the conscious and deliberate destruction of fleeing Afghans who are going to die in silence, invisibly, and also not instantly. You don't die from starvation at once. People can survive for months or a long time on roots and grasses. And if a malnourished infant dies of disease, who's going to know or care what the cause was? In the future, the topic's off the agenda. And that's because of a crucial principle of our intellectual culture. The principle is that we must devote enormous energy to meticulous accounting of the crimes of official enemies, and in that case we must quite properly include not only those literally killed, but also those who die as a consequence of the actions. And we have to take equally scrupulous care to avoid this practice in the case of our own crimes, in the style that de Tocqueville described. There are hundreds of pages of detailed documentation documenting how these principles are applied in practice, and I suppose it's a historical universal. It would be a very welcome surprise if the current case turns out different. And we should remember that we're not observing this from Mars, and we're not talking about crimes of Genghis Khan. There's a great deal that we can do about all this right at this moment if we choose to. Well, to explore what's likely to lie ahead from a different perspective, let's ask whether there was an alternative to the resort to devastating force at a distance, a device that comes quite naturally to those who have overwhelming power, no external deterrent, and confidence in the obedience of articulate opinion. I'll assume here what is not obvious, that they know the perpetrators. So given that assumption, were there alternatives? Well, there were alternatives, quite obvious ones, and quite prominently suggested, for example, by the Vatican or by the most eminent Anglo-American military historian, Michael Howard, and by quite a few others. The alternative is to identify the perpetrators, the likely perpetrators, produce credible evidence, and turn to appropriate international authorities to bring the crimes to justice. Could that have worked without the resort to massive violence? Well, we can't know for sure, of course, because it was never tried. But very possibly might have. We don't have any way of knowing whether the tentative offers by the Taliban to do just that were serious. We don't know because they were instantly dismissed for the reasons I already mentioned. To pursue that option would have been to undermine credibility, and therefore they were dismissed, and we don't know if it would have worked. Are there any precedents for pursuing a lawful course? Yeah, there are plenty of precedents. Some of them, again, are uncontroversial, like, say, Nicaragua. Recall that the terrible crimes, the terrorist crimes in Nicaragua were far worse than even September 11th. That left tens of thousands of people killed, the country virtually destroyed, may never recover. Until after the U.S. took over again in 1990, it's declined still further, quite sharply. It's now the second poorest country in the hemisphere after Haiti. Haiti, you might recall, is the prime target of U.S. intervention in the 20th century and the poorest country in the hemisphere. Nicaragua and Guatemala vie for the honor of being the second most poorest countries in the hemisphere, and they're also vying for the honor of being second in terms of U.S. intervention. That might suggest some lessons, but you'll look hard to find them, and it generalizes, incidentally. Nicaragua did not react to the terrorist atrocities by setting off bombs in Washington. What they did is go to the World Court. They won their case, went to the Security Council, received endorsement in a vetoed resolution, of course, went to the General Assembly, where again in successive years they received virtually unanimous endorsement. The U.S. and one or two client states opposed. They were stymied by the rule of force. The U.S. simply dismissed the orders of the World Court to terminate the international terrorism and pay substantial reparations, and in fact immediately reacted by escalating the war. And there was nothing Nicaragua could do about that, at least nothing lawful. However, if the United States were to pursue the same course, there wouldn't be any barriers, quite the contrary. The barrier is simply that would undermine credibility, and therefore you can't do it. Also, in this case, there would be the slight problem of providing evidence, which Nicaragua had no problem making a case that the court accepted. It wouldn't be so simple in this case. I should say that the Nicaragua case is by no means the most extreme example of international terrorism and state terrorism during that period, unfortunately. But it is important, crucially, because it's the most uncontroversial case. It is totally uncontroversial, at least among people who have a minimal respect for international law, human rights, and treaty obligations. Again, uncontroversial because we can just appeal to the judgment of the World Court, and the Security Council, and the General Assembly. That's the highest appeal. We can estimate the scale of the size of the category of people who have a minimal respect for human rights and international law. That's very easy. There's an easy test of that. Just ask how often any of these obvious facts have been brought up or even alluded to in the huge flood of material that's poured out in the last couple of months about international terrorism and what one should do about it. And recall that the war against terrorism, the new war against terrorism, is being conducted by the condemned criminals, the criminals who were condemned for international terrorism, often the very same people. And they are the ones who are ignoring the precedent that was established by their own victims of international terrorism. Well, that suggests some conclusions about where the world is heading. I think they're obvious enough, so I don't have to comment on them. Actually, if you look more closely, it's even more grotesque. Well, I mentioned a few of those who had suggested alternatives. I haven't mentioned the most important of them. The most important place to look, of course, is the people of Afghanistan. What do they suggest? Well, that's a pretty difficult question to answer, but it's not impossible. There's some obvious places to look. So, for example, there has been, at last, some attention, finally, to some concern for the fate of women in Afghanistan, even reached as far as the First Lady. Maybe it'll someday be followed by comparable concern for the plight of women elsewhere in Central and South Asia, which unfortunately is not all that different. We should bear in mind it is not all that different from life for women under the Taliban. There's plenty of highly credible evidence about that, if you want to look. In Afghanistan, there is an organization of courageous women who have been leading the struggle to defend women's rights and to establish a democratic government. They've been doing it for 25 years. That's RAWA, the Revolutionary Association of Women of Afghanistan. And they've done quite remarkable work over these 25 years. Their leader was assassinated by an Afghan collaborator with the KGB back in 1987, but they continued their work within Afghanistan and in exile. And they've been quite outspoken, they're not quiet. So, for example, they issued a public statement on October 11th, it's a week after the bombing began. The heading of the statement is, "Taliban should be overthrown by uprising of Afghans." And then goes on like this, says, again, due to the treason of fundamentalist hangmen, our people have been caught in the claws of the monster of a vast war and destruction. America, by forming an international coalition against Osama and his Taliban collaborators, and in retaliation for the 11th September terrorist attacks, has launched a vast aggression against our country. Despite the claim of the United States that only military and terrorist bases of the Taliban and al-Qaeda will be struck, and that its actions would be accurately targeted and proportionate, we've witnessed for the past 7 days, what we have witnessed leaves no doubt that this invasion will shed the blood of numerous women, men, children, young and old of our country. And of course, the fate of the refugees is even worse. And it goes on to call for a mass uprising to eradicate the plague of the Taliban, an uprising carried out by the people of Afghanistan, not foreign interests who will perpetrate the plague in some other form, they expect. And they're not alone in that. So before he entered Afghanistan, apparently without any Western support, then was captured and killed, the Afghan opposition leader, Abdul Haq, who was very highly regarded in the West, he condemned the bombing publicly and openly. He criticized the United States for refusing to support the efforts by him and by others to, and quoting him now, to create a revolt within the Taliban. The bombing, he said, was a big setback for these efforts. He claimed to have established contacts with second-level Taliban commanders, ex-Mujahideen, tribal elders, and he went on to discuss some detail how such efforts could proceed. And he called on the United States to help, but with funding and other such support, and not with bombing, which was setting back the efforts. That same message was conveyed by a gathering of 1,000 Afghan leaders in Peshawar in Pakistan at the end of October. Some of them had trekked in from Afghanistan across the border. Others were exiles. They were all committed to overthrowing the Taliban. It was, the New York Times described it as a rare display of unity among tribal leaders, Islamic scholars, fractious politicians, and former guerrilla commanders. And they unanimously, urgently demanded that the United States stop the air raids. They appealed to the international media to call for an end to the bombing of innocent people and to stop the destruction of Afghanistan. They disagreed on a lot, but they were unanimous about that. They called for other ways to overthrow the hated Taliban regime, the same ways that were called for by Rawa and by Abdul Haq, and they believed that to be possible without the mass slaughter and destruction that the West would prefer. Well, maybe Afghans who've been struggling for freedom and for women's rights for many years, maybe they just don't understand anything about their country, and they should just cede responsibility to foreigners who couldn't have placed the country on a map a couple of months ago, led by commanders who were condemned for international terrorism by the highest international authorities and supported by a coalition of leading terrorist states. Maybe, but it's not entirely obvious. Actually, it's quite reminiscent of the Iraq War. Not only that, but take that one. You recall, I'm sure, that during that period, the Iraqi opposition which is strong and outspoken, they were scrupulously barred from the media, 100%, and journals of opinion, apart from dissident journals way out at the margins. And there was a reason for that. They opposed the U.S. bombing, and they accused the United States of preferring a military dictatorship to overthrow of Saddam Hussein by an internal revolt. Not only did they say that, but that fact was confirmed. It was conceded, in fact, publicly, after Bush number one, collaborated with Saddam in brutally crushing a revolt in March 1991. That's right after the war was over, when the U.S. had total control. Official U.S. spokesman at that time confirmed that the Bush administration would have no dealings with Iraq's opposition leaders. We felt that political meetings with them would not be appropriate for our policy at that time. That's the State Department spokesman, Richard Boucher, on March 14th, 1991, right at the moment while Saddam was massacring Southern rebels with tacit U.S. support. That had been long-standing government policy, incidentally, and it's not unusual. And there's good reasons for it, and the reasons were explained. They preferred the diplomatic correspondent of the New York Times, Thomas Friedman, accurately said, without criticism, that the U.S. preferred an iron-fisted Iraqi military junta that would rule Iraq the same way Saddam Hussein did, but under a different name, because the name was embarrassing, and therefore it was necessary to massacre the rebels. It's not unusual. It's being relived in the past few months. It's this rejection of possibly feasible diplomatic options that runs right through the wars of the 1990s. I won't go through the details, but it's true of every single case. There's another sensible way to assess the prospects ahead. That would be to review the action of today's commanders when they launched the first war on terrorism. And remember, this is not the first war on terrorism. It was launched in virtually the same terms and with the same passion 20 years ago, when the Reagan administration came into office and was then declared to be the heart of our foreign policy. Well, that's the terrible decade of the 1980s. Can learn a lot about what happened then, and from the fact that the topic is scrupulously ignored in the laudatory chorus for the current and the future plans of the very same people. The commanders who were condemned for international terrorism in one of the lesser cases that they were involved in. All of this is familiar. I'm not going to review it. It's obviously relevant. That should be obvious too. Well, at the end of that decade, the end of the 80s, there was a change, big change in world affairs. The external deterrent to the use of force disappeared. For its victims, that was a remarkable triumph and liberation, although that victory was tainted very quickly by new crimes. For others, the consequences were more ambiguous. The basic character of the post-Cold War era was revealed very quickly. A couple of weeks after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the United States invaded Panama, killed hundreds or maybe thousands of people. Since it's our crimes, nobody looks and nobody cares, but something of that order. A lot of destruction, vetoed two Security Council resolutions, kidnapped, the idea was to kidnap a thug who was then brought to the United States and tried for crimes that he had committed almost entirely while he was on the CIA payroll, before he committed the only crime that mattered, namely disobedience. Well, all of this is kind of like a footnote to history. You don't even bother talking about it. But it was different in one respect. That was pointed out very quickly by Elliott Abrams. He had, you recall, pleaded guilty for crimes during the Reagan administration. As a reward, he's now a human rights specialist at the National Security Council. And he made an astute comment at that time. He pointed out that this is the first time that the United States has been able to intervene without any concern about a Russian reaction, which is true. The deterrent is gone. Also, it required new pretexts. So you recall the invasion of Panama was not because the Russians are coming, but because the Hispanic narco-traffickers are coming. And the search for new pretexts continues. All of this became very clear in an important document that everyone should perfectly public, that everyone should read who wants to understand anything about international affairs. And maybe that's the reason why it's never alluded to, as far as I know. The obviously most important document to look at right after the end of the Cold War was the Bush administration's presentation to Congress calling for a military budget. The question is, what are they going to say? In March 1990, there's an answer to that question. It's a couple of months after the fall of the wall, no Russians. Bush administration produced the usual annual White House document to Congress calling for a huge military budget. The document, when you read it, is about the same as before, but with a few differences. The main difference is pretexts. It turns out we don't need the military budget because the Russians are coming. They're not coming, but because of the technological sophistication of third world powers. That's why we need the world's biggest military budget. And for the same reason, we have to maintain what's called the defense industrial base. That's a euphemism for high-tech industry. Got to maintain that. And we also have to maintain the massive intervention forces aimed at the Middle East, as they had been for years, the oil-producing regions of the Middle East. And then came an interesting phrase that said we must maintain these intervention forces aimed at the Middle East, then, where the threat to our interests could not be laid at the Kremlin's door. So, sorry, we've been lying to you for 50 years, but now we got to tell the truth. The problem is indigenous. It's indigenous nationalism. Notice the threat could not be laid at Iraq's door either then, because that was March 1990, and Saddam Hussein was a great friend and ally of George Bush in the United States and London. Well, that's a very revealing document. It's interesting to check and see how often it's been referred to. You can learn a lot from that. Don't bother doing it. You won't find anything. Another consequence of the collapse of the deterrent is that there's no space left for independence and non-alignment. And in fact, the non-aligned movement essentially collapsed at that point. The one indication of the collapse of this concern is the very sharp decline in foreign aid in the decade that followed. In the United States, declined to virtually zero. There's no longer any need for it for essentially propaganda purposes. And the effects of this were recognized very quickly. So President Mahathir of Malaysia, for example, pointed out right away. He said, paradoxically, the greatest catastrophe for us, who had always been anti-communist, is the defeat of communism. The end of the Cold War has deprived us of the only leverage we had, the option to defect. Now we can turn to no one, and there is furthermore no deterrent. And those fears were expressed very clearly throughout the South. The Gulf War, which followed very quickly, it was bitterly condemned throughout the South as a needless show of force designed to demonstrate that what we say goes. Recall George Bush's words as the bombs and the missiles were falling. In this case, too, there's good reason to suppose that there were peaceful alternatives, diplomatic alternatives were available, and there's in fact good reason to suppose that the Bush administration was feared that they might become difficult to suppress. The media cooperated nicely. The general mood in the South at that time was captured rather well by Cardinal Arns, Cardinal Paulo Avarista Arns of São Paulo, Brazil. He said that, correctly, that in the Arab countries, the rich sided with the U.S. government, while the millions of poor condemned this military aggression. joining the ignored Iraqi opposition, he could have added. Throughout the third world, he continued, there is hatred and fear. When will they decide to invade us, and on what pretext? The reaction to the bombing of Serbia was very much the same throughout the world. Again, there's quite compelling evidence that peaceful options were available that might have spared plenty of misery, but it was bitterly condemned throughout the world, even in U.S. allies, U.S. client states like Israel. Leading military analysts simply dismissed it as a show of return to the gunboat diplomacy of the last century, cloaked by the same hypocrisy. Well, Americans are very carefully protected from any of this. We're protected from world opinion and protected from critical discussion. So you have to really work to find out any of these things. But we don't do ourselves any favors by keeping to these restrictions. And we also do ourselves no favors by ignoring the public documents that explain very clearly the thinking of planners about the world that they're creating, and they have overwhelming power to create. They understand very well, as we should, that the world is what's called tripolar in economic terms. That is, there are roughly comparable centers of economic power in Asia, Europe, and North America. But the world is radically unipolar in the capacity to destroy, to resort to violence and destroy. The United States already outspends the next 15 countries for what's called defense, and defense, as always, means offense. And it's far ahead in military technology. And the current plans, as you all know, are to sharply increase that disparity. That includes extending the arms race into space, which means demolishing the Outer Space Treaty that's been observed since 1967. Ballistic missile defense is only a small part of this, and even that is well understood to be an offensive weapon, not a defensive weapon. It's understood by adversaries, it's understood by strategic analysts here. So the RAND Corporation, for example, describes the BMD as an enabler of action, not a shield. Strategic analysts say the same thing. In fact, they applaud the program typically as a means to establish U.S. global hegemony. And they explain, that that's what the world needs. I won't quote it since I've just been warned to shut up, but it's interesting comments, which have many. They just mimic many predecessors. You know, all of this is totally familiar for hundreds of years. They explain very clearly that there's the far broader program of militarization of space. That's also explained very clearly and quite intelligently in perfectly public documents. No reason not to know them. They point out that this is the Space Command, that this is the natural next step in expanding state power. So armies and then navies were established in order to protect commercial interests and investment, and the next obvious frontier is space for the same reasons, to protect commercial interests and investment. However, they point out there's going to be a difference this time. The British had a huge navy for that purpose, but it was possible to counter it. Germany could develop a navy. Don't have to talk about the consequences. This case is going to be different. This arms race is going to have only one competitor running. And just like now, and there will be a sole hegemon. The United States is going to be so awesomely powerful that there won't be any counterforce. That's, first of all, necessary for just plain technical reasons. The whole space war system is based on satellites, and satellites are very easy to shoot down. They're not like missiles. So you have to make sure that no adversary has the poor man's weapon, anti-satellite weapons, and that requires overwhelming dominance of space, which is understood and intended. And there's another reason. The other reason is that what they call globalization is expected to lead to a widening divide between the haves and the have-nots. That's an assessment that's shared by U.S. intelligence and others. Notice that's contrary to the theories that you're supposed to believe in, but it's quite in accord with practice. And it's going to be necessary, they conclude reasonably, to control the unruly elements. How do you do that? Well, by inspiring fear, or by actual use of highly destructive killing machines launched from space, laser weapons, probably nuclear powered, on a hair trigger automated alert system, which is a virtual guarantee of what are called normal accidents, meaning the kinds of accidents that will always take place unpredictably in complex systems. It's recognized that these programs significantly increase the danger of unimaginable catastrophe, but that too is entirely rational. It's important to recognize that. It's entirely rational within the framework of prevailing institutions and ideology. The principle is that hegemony just ranks a lot higher than survival. There's ample precedents for that right through the Cold War. Easy to give examples, and well before. The only difference is that by now the stakes are far higher, the survival of the species, and that's no exaggeration. Well, these are some of the prospects if current tendencies persist, but there isn't no reason at all for this to happen. There is good news. The good news is that the reigning system of authority is very fragile, and they know it. There's a major effort right now, as you're aware, to exploit the current mood of anguish and fear in order to ram through harsh, regressive, dangerous programs. Militarization of space is only one, and in order to, and it's being used to deflect the mass popular movements that have been taking shape in an unprecedented and highly encouraging ways. But there's no reason at all to succumb to those efforts. There's every reason not to. There are plenty of choices and options available. What's needed, as always, is will and dedication to pursue them.